What did you think of James Fields, the guy who allegedly drove his car into the crowd in Charlottesville?
I say, bless his heart, because he sure is in a jam.
So you're sympathetic?
Oh, very sympathetic, totally sympathetic.
To you, Fields is a hero.
Yes.
The nation was unraveling in ways both visible and unseen. The post-Vietnam consensus had collapsed, leaving behind a battered economy, rising violent crime rates, and a public drowning in cynicism. In California, news cameras swarmed the Los Angeles County Courthouse as the Manson family trials entered yet another lurid chapter. The apocalyptic murder cult's shadow still darkening American culture a decade after the Tate LaBianca killings. Across the country, Christian televangelists warned of moral decay, communists hiding in universities, and Satanists lurking in suburban cul-de-sacs. In Washington, the dawn of the Reagan era brought with it the promise of national rebirth, but also a rising culture war and the radicalization of both left and right. And somewhere in the smog-choked streets of Denver, a forgotten man in his 30s sat hunched over a typewriter in a dingy apartment, pounding out manifesto after manifesto on yellowing paper. His name was James Nolan Mason, and though most Americans had never heard of him, his ideas would outlive him and kill in his name. Mason was not a murderer by hand, but by word. A veteran of the American Nazi Party, Mason had long since abandoned dreams of mass marches and political parties. He had seen what the American right preferred to ignore, that the future of fascism in America lay not in ballot boxes or orderly rallies, but in random, apocalyptic violence. In the pages of his self-published newsletter Siege, Mason preached a doctrine of guerrilla war and leaderless terror, a strategy that openly encouraged lone wolf massacres, assassinations, and bombings designed to bring down what he called the system. He praised serial killers as misunderstood prophets. He lionized Charles Manson as a visionary who grasped the necessity of racial war. He called for the total destruction of the U.S. government and celebrated acts of terrorism, not for political negotiation, but to collapse society itself and rebuild it as a fascist ethno-state from the ashes. His words didn't stay confined to crumbling zines and hate literature archives. Decades later, Atomwaffen Division, a neo-Nazi terror cell responsible for multiple murders in the US and linked to international plots, would elevate Mason's Siege as their sacred text. In online forums and encrypted chat rooms, Read Siege became a meme and a command. Killers would cite Mason's ideology as justification for hate crimes and mass shootings, exactly as he intended. The 1980s saw Mason blending the worst of American countercultural violence with Nazi ideology, defending terrorism as common sense, and urging extremists to wage random attacks to hasten what he envisioned as an inevitable race war. Mason's essays didn't just flirt with violence, they demanded it. In this way, James Mason's greatest weapon wasn't a gun or a bomb, but a typewriter and an audience of the already lost. His influence would metastasize in the decaying moral landscape of late 20th century America, and later thrive in the nihilistic meme culture of the internet's darkest corners. What was once fringe ideology printed on mimeographed sheets in Denver would one day bleed into murder scenes in Florida, Virginia, and California. In the early months of 1980, the United States seemed poised at the edge of a chasm it barely understood. Hostages languished in Tehran. Gas prices surged past $1 a gallon, and long, angry lines formed at stations from San Diego to Cincinnati. In Los Angeles, a wave of serial murders had reduced the city's mood to a brittle, adrenalized fear. Families bolted their doors to a daily litany of violence. The freeway killer, the Sunset Strip Slayers, the Hillside Stranglers. Newspapers piled up with stories of nihilistic spree killings, satanic cult rumors, and suburban teenagers found dead in drainage culverts. The Vietnam War was over, but had left a bruised, paranoid nation in its wake. Its youth movements dissolved into drugs and disillusion, its cities hollowed by economic malaise and racial unrest. Ronald Reagan, former actor and hardline governor of California, was riding a crest of cultural nostalgia and reactionary fervor toward the White House, promising to make America great again with tax cuts, religious revivalism, and a war on permissiveness. The moral majority's televangelists railed against homosexuality, abortion, and rock music, while survivalist enclaves stockpiled canned goods and assault rifles in Montana and Idaho. It was a moment when old gods were dying, new ones were unformed, and fringe ideologies, left and right alike, throve in the margins of a crumbling consensus. It was in this uncertain, adrenalized cultural twilight that James Nolan Mason began sending out his mimeographed newsletter, Siege, to a handful of scattered subscribers. A 27-year-old drifter and neo-Nazi propagandist, Mason was already a veteran of America's far-right subcultures. He had once idolized George Lincoln Rockwell's American Nazi Party, donned its brown shirt uniform, and paraded with swastika banners before Rockwell's 1967 assassination splintered the movement into petty, vicious fiefdoms. Mason's own trajectory was darker still. In Siege, which would run from 1980 to 1986, Mason distilled a virulent strain of white supremacist accelerationism. The belief that civilization was doomed and that neo-Nazis should not attempt to reform the system, but hasten its collapse through terrorism, assassination, and random violence. His prose was lurid, repetitive, and unhinged, yet it tapped into a cultural undercurrent that few in mainstream society were willing to acknowledge: the unresolved residue of America's fascination with apocalyptic violence. At the heart of Mason's philosophy was a fixation on Charles Manson, the cult leader and murderer whose 1969 helter-skelter rampage had become a grotesque national fable. Mason, convinced by prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi's claim that Manson sought to incite a race war, reimagined the hippie guru as a visionary guerrilla commander. He treated Manson's cryptic interviews and swastika-carved forehead as sacred texts and urged his readers to follow Manson's example by unleashing chaos upon the modern world. But if Mason was a prophet, he was also a paradox. By 2019, decades after Siege's final issue, Mason was living in a subsidized Denver apartment, surviving on federal assistance and soup kitchen meals. The man who had declared war on the system was now one of its most pitiful dependents. Yet Siege had long since outlived its author's relevance, passed hand to hand through the shadowy corners of industrial music zines, LaVeyan Satanist circles, and black metal forums, its ideas metastasizing in obscure subcultures until they re-emerged in the 2010s in the bloodied hands of Atomwaffen Division. Atomwaffen, whose name meant Atomic Weapons Division in German, was a decentralized neo-Nazi terror cell built around apocalyptic accelerationism and occult-infused fascism. Its young members, dressed in paramilitary gear and skeleton face masks, saw Mason as a martyr philosopher. They posed for photos in front of swastika flags, clutching AR-15s, with Mason at the center, a shriveled patriarch grinning like a minor demon in a dying B-movie. Their crimes included the murder of Jewish college student Blaise Bernstein in California and the planned assassinations of journalists and anti-fascist activists. What made Mason's survival particularly perverse was the irony of his newfound influence. In the Reagan years, he had been a crank mailing mimeographed manifestos to maybe 100 readers. Now, his words had become gospel to a generation of alienated, nihilistic young men raised on memes, mass shootings, and online culture wars. The dark energy that Siege represented had been given new form by the internet, which allowed edgelords, occultists, and would-be revolutionaries to radicalize each other in echo chambers where irony bled into sincere hatred. Much of this cross-pollination began in the 1980s and 1990s, when shock jock publishers like Adam Parfrey's Feral House and musicians like Boyd Rice treated figures like Mason and Manson as taboo-breaking provocateurs. Their subcultural projects trafficked in satanic imagery, serial killer lore, and racial transgression, often insisting their interest was ironic or aesthetic rather than ideological. Yet Mason's own correspondence, unearthed by researcher Spencer Sunshine, revealed that these boundary pushers privately expressed admiration for his views. The Abraxas clique, as Sunshine dubbed them, laid the groundwork for the fascist irony that would become a hallmark of internet-era radicalization. The America that allowed Mason's ideas to germinate was one fractured by Cold War anxieties, economic collapse, and rising crime rates. The serial killer panic of the 1970s, cult scares of the early 80s, and satanic panic of the mid-decade created a moral climate ripe for authoritarian fantasy. Both left and right pined for purification, whether through revolutionary violence or reactionary repression. Into this fevered ecosystem of fear and longing, Siege arrived like a stray match in a parched forest. Mason's core premise, that the system was irredeemable and deserved to burn, echoed the tactics of leftist groups like the Weather Underground, but replaced revolutionary utopianism with genocidal nihilism. It spoke to the darkest corners of American alienation, loners, outcasts, and paranoids eager to punish a society they felt had discarded them. Mason glorified serial killers and mass shooters as natural soldiers of this doomed war, claiming any act of destabilization served the cause. Even as Mason descended into obscurity, the network seeded by his writing endured. Atomwaffen Division, founded on the defunct Iron March Forum in 2015, compiled Siege into a 563-page PDF, distributing it alongside manifestos by Timothy McVeigh, Anders Breivik, and Dylan Roof. In chat rooms and encrypted servers, members debated tactics for accelerating social collapse through infrastructure attacks, mass shootings, and race war. By the late 2010s, US and European intelligence agencies quietly acknowledged siege culture as a credible domestic terror threat. Mason's old Denver neighbors, meanwhile, saw a frail pensioner eager to help with yard work and attend community potlucks. The duality was obscene, a foot soldier of genocidal fantasy, sustained by the very system he despised. In retrospect, Mason's obscurity was his most effective weapon. Unlike headline-grabbing white nationalists, he lingered in the shadows, his words diffused through subcultural niches until the line between irony and ideology dissolved. America's perverse hunger for transgression ensured his survival. And even now, in the flickering corners of the web, his prophecies of collapse endure, improbably modern, bleakly adaptable to a digital age still stalking its own end.
Small wonder that mainstream media missed him.
Siege was legally published. Citizenship was retained. No indictable conspiracy. Yet the arguments were there. A cell in Ohio could follow the blueprint, or a disillusioned young man lured online decades later. Mason built pockets of thought. Under the radar, he mentored. During those years, anti-abortion bombings, eco-terrorism, black militant outrages, and even white supremacist murders were reported in papers. But they were never contextualized as part of a broad breakdown in national coherence. Instead, each was a lone extremist, disconnected. And Siege exploited that misreading. By distributing carefully radicalized rhetoric, Mason seeded the ideological welts parents would never see until decades later. Meanwhile, in back rooms of small left-wing music scenes and occult festivals, another network of shock jocks, industrial artists, teenage provocateurs, emergent Satanists, started quoting Manson ironically. Musicians like Boyd Rice and Michael Moynihan curated Mason into apocalypse culture anthologies in the late 1980s, reprinting excerpts of Siege. Eccentric, sterile words delivered in cold typeface suddenly sank into an underground culture celebrating transgression. To many, it was harmless, part of the edgy aesthetic of the period. But repeated exposure to lines like select and consecutive assassinations began to shape the psychosphere. The trick was subtle. Layer extremist narrative beneath the veneer of irony, and watch discursive absorption happen. Then came the 1990s. Mason receded. Prison stints, threatened charges involving minors, increasing obscurity. But cultural currents shifted. The internet offered new vectors. Chat rooms replaced pages, memes replaced mimeographs. Theoretical fascists found each other. Siege texts re-emerged on forums like Iron March, Reddit splinter rooms, and dark blogs, most stripped of nonconformist aesthetic codes and now repurposed as militant doctrine. It was only a matter of time before new groups, Atomwaffen Division, the Base, Order of Nine Angles disciples, found Siege and elevated it. The textual publishing format of Mason's essays remained, but the audience had grown. Now, readers were on Twitter, Telegram, Discord. What was once inaudible became amplified. When Atomwaffen recruits were required to read Siege, Mason was no longer the eccentric cellist of fringe neo-Nazis. He had become the godfather of contemporary white supremacist accelerationism, a tactical philosopher who stood behind unsolved murders and arming sessions in rental cabins. Apocalypse culture and the Abraxas clique. By the mid-1980s, America was high on moral panic. Satanic cults were, according to breathless TV specials, lurking in suburban daycares. Heavy metal records allegedly carried hidden messages, driving teenagers to suicide. The nightly news toggled between the Iran-Contra scandal and lurid true crime stories, the McMartin preschool case, Jeffrey Dahmer's first murders, a police chase of the Unabomber in Montana. The country, as one cultural critic put it in 1987, was haunted by invisible armies. In basements and late-night radio shows, the fantasy of clandestine conspiracies bent on eroding the American way of life felt tangible. This was the atmosphere into which apocalypse culture emerged. An underground anthology published by Adam Parfrey's Feral House in 1987. It was a book of essays and manifestos documenting the grotesque, the taboo, and the forbidden fringes of subcultures, both fictional and frighteningly real. Buried amid its collection of Satanists, self-mutilators, and doomsday prophets were selections from James Mason's Siege. To the untrained eye, it was a curiosity, the ravings of a white supremacist crank. To others, particularly those already orbiting the punk, industrial, and occult scenes of Los Angeles, it was something more dangerous. A call to nihilistic violence, disguised as intellectual provocation. Mason never mingled directly with this clique of avant-garde edgelords, but his work passed through their hands. Musician Boyd Rice, an industrial noise pioneer, known for his flirtations with fascist aesthetics, became one of Mason's quiet champions. Letters were exchanged. Feral House reprinted Siege essays in subsequent zines. Michael Moynihan, an author and musician whose later work would controversially romanticize Norwegian black metal murderers and other violent reactionaries, corresponded with Mason during this period. These were people fluent in transgression for its own sake, and Mason's blood-soaked apocalyptic fantasies fit the pose. The irony is that many within this orbit would have disavowed overt neo-Nazism. Their posture was one of perverse detachment, exploring fascist imagery while claiming a kind of moral remove, hiding behind irony, aesthetics, or an interest in taboo psychology. Yet, as Spencer Sunshine's later research would reveal, the boundaries between ironic fascination and genuine belief in these circles were thinner than anyone wanted to admit. It was here that Mason's ideology evolved. Realizing that Hitler worship alone could no longer shock or mobilize, he began to frame his worldview as part of a larger cosmic order, what he called the universal order. In his writings from the late 80s, Mason envisioned a coming apocalypse in which race war, state collapse, and social disintegration would clear the path for a new, purer civilization. One need not be white, he conceded in one essay, so long as they recognize the supremacy of natural hierarchy. It was a strategic pivot, a vision of fascism dressed up in metaphysical terms, palatable to alienated misanthropes of every background. This idea, that civilization should be violently dismantled to allow a new elite to emerge, wasn't new. It echoed the fascist mysticism of figures like Julius Evola and the nihilistic terror manifestos of left-wing groups like the Weather Underground. Mason was borrowing from the same revolutionary playbook he outwardly despised. And yet, in the America of 1989, this fringe paranoia existed alongside a mainstream culture gripped by its own apocalyptic fears. The Berlin Wall fell. David Koresh was building his stockpile in Waco. The Turner Diaries, another white supremacist novel of race war fantasy, circulated among survivalists and gun show booths. The public anxiously awaited the year 2000 with a mix of eschatological dread and technophobic paranoia. Mason understood instinctively that beneath all the flag-waving and Reaganite optimism, Americans were terrified of their neighbors, and the best way to harness that fear was not through persuasion, but through catastrophe.